Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be looking back at history and asking, did Britain fail the Jewish people and the promises made in the Balfour Declaration and the San Remo Agreement during the years of the British Mandate? Warm welcome to the programme, and my guest today is all the way from the northeast of England. His name is David Gibson. He's an author and historian. David, warm welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Pleasure. We have a friend of yours, Jeff, to thank for you being here today. He got in touch with me, sent me an email, and he also sent me a copy of your latest book, which is called Israel and the British Empire. And if it wasn't for him, you wouldn't be here today, because he's a passionate supporter of yours. He's got an incredible story of himself, of being a dairy farmer and having a love for Israel and the Jewish people. So I'm very grateful for Jeff for getting in touch with me personally, and this is why you're here today. But can you share with us, David, how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ?
Well, it's like everybody else, it's a long story. I'll try and do it as briefly as possible. I was brought up in a good home, but not a Christian home, or not overtly Christian. Good values, did well at school, went to university. People expected me to do very well, and it just went wrong at university. And even today, looking back, it's difficult for me to understand why. But I just got into a bit of a state, a bit of a mess, a bit of a downward spiral. People didn't talk in those days about mental health issues, but looking back on it now, it's a bit of a self-diagnosis from 30 years ago, but I was probably quite depressed at that time. The end result of all of that was that I obtained a degree, but it wasn't a very good degree. It was a third-class honours degree, which, was not considered at that time to be a reflection of anywhere near what I should have attained. And, I'd doing all sorts of things that I shouldn't do, and I won't go into those details. I'm sure people understand. And what I discovered at the age of 21 is that no one would give me a job. And I totally understand why. As somebody now who employs people, I wouldn't have given myself a job when I was in the state that I was as a 21-year-old. And just in this spiral of just down, of despair, I tried all sorts of things to try and, in a sense, almost resurrect my life. I can remember getting into going to the gym a lot, doing weights a lot, trying to be physically strong. I know this sounds totally bonkers, but I really did buy the complete works of Shakespeare and actually read the complete works of Shakespeare in a 6-month period.
Amazing.
And that was all just about me trying to find a handle, trying to improve the mind, really. So you get the idea of somebody who's hit this pit of despair, is trying to climb out of it and trying to kind of just find some purpose and meaning in a life that wasn't working out the way it was supposed to do. And one of the ideas I came upon was to travel, and that involved going to Australia backpacking for 12 months. And that's when it changed. So I found myself in Surfers Paradise on the Gold Coast, working in a hotel, working night shift, literally the graveyard from 11 o'clock at night till 7 in the morning. And I worked that shift for a period of about 3 months with 2 guys. Now, those 2 guys were Bible college students at a Bible college on the Gold Coast, and they were working the night shift in that hotel in order to pay their way through Bible college. And probably it was the first time in my life that I'd encountered Christians who had conviction and passion, but who were natural. I'm going to say normal. I was trying to avoid, but they were just normal, decent guys, the kind of guys that I would hang out with, because I was the same age as me, 22, 23 by now, did the same kind of things, thought the same kind of things as me, but they had this conviction in faith in Jesus Christ. And I remember one of them asking me, one of them asked me the question, why did you come to Australia? What made you want to come and take this year out? And it's a horrific cliche, but I really did say, this is the absolute words that came out of my mouth was, I'm just trying to find meaning in life. And for two passionate Bible college students, young men, very passionate about the faith, clearly I understand now, looking back, what an open door that was. I was a gift to them. Yeah. Now, it took a while. I used to work with those guys every night. It was a long time ago, and nobody that was employing us will know anything about this, but we didn't do a lot of work. We spent a lot of time through the night sitting in the staff canteen. There was just the three of us in the hotel, literally 3 or 4 hours, just talking about things. And not always, but very often they were talking about the faith. And and it was something that was new to me that I'd never seen before. They invited me to church. I was hesitant to go, but I was very interested in what they were telling me. I had some doubts about it, but they were able to answer the questions. I didn't expect them. I think one of the first conversations I had with them is I'd said to them, well, I get the New Testament, that's fine, all the Jesus stuff, that's okay. It's Genesis, it's creation, it's Noah's Ark, it's all that stuff that makes it ridiculous. And I honestly expected that would be the end of the conversation and that I'd won just by saying that. And being quite blindsided when they began to answer that question and talk about that with conviction and talk about creation and talk about the truth of the Bible and tell me things I'd never heard before and talk about some of the faults in evolution and why creation is a reasonable thing to believe. And I just wasn't expecting that. And piece by piece over a 3-month period, I came to a position where I was ready to give it a go. And the backpacking hostel that I was staying in, directly across the road, literally within touching distance, was an Australian Assemblies of God church in Surfers Paradise. And at that time, they had a big sign on the building, just simply red letters, Jesus is Lord, that's all it said. And every day I was sitting around the pool in the backpacking hostel, and the building was literally preaching to me, Jesus is Lord. And then I'd go to work and spending time with these two guys. And obviously I look back at that now and I totally understand that God just had a plan and a purpose. That was my time, and God was in everything that was going on, and he was reaching out to me in a big way that I wasn't looking for him. I was looking for something, but I didn't know I was looking for him. And after about 3 or 4 months, I surrendered.
Amen. Amen. When did the Lord place a love for Israel and the Jewish people upon your heart, David?
Well, that's interesting. I've thought about this, and I didn't understand it at the time. But I heard a preacher a number of years ago. And I've been a Christian too long, and I can't remember who, and I can't remember exactly when. But the gist of his message is that God often plants the seed of a person's life and ministry at the point that they become a Christian. The seed is planted there. And going back to these two young Australian lads that I was working with, I can remember one of the questions that I asked them was, well, if God did this, and we see this in the Old Testament, you're telling me about this, why don't we see miracles today? Why don't we evidently see God doing the same kind of things if he was performing all of these miracles that we read about in the Old Testament? And they told me about the miracle of Israel. And I don't think I'd ever even thought about Israel in my life up until that point. But they told me, they answered that question. They told me about all of the prophecies, how they'd been fulfilled in very detailed and literal ways. They told me about how the Jewish people had been dispersed for 2,000 years and persecuted, and how this was in 1990, so at that point, just over 40 years had passed, how the Lord had gathered them back together into their land just in the way that he said he would, and how the language had come back to life, and even how the land had come back. They told me all of this. It was obviously something that they were taught at Bible college. I understand that now. So not just that the people were restored to Israel, but that the land itself, which was a barren wilderness, had begun to shoot forth crops again and literally come to life. And in very detailed ways. And they told me about the 6-Day War, and the other wars that Israel had fought, and how the battles were miraculous, the scale of the victory and the odds that Israel were facing. And you talk about the numbers that were involved in terms of the size of the opposition, and then you look at the casualty figures, the number of planes that were shot down on or that were destroyed on the ground by the Israeli Air Force. It was of biblical proportions, that the size of that victory. And so I believe that that seed of what I'm doing now was planted right then. Though I didn't understand that then, and I didn't do anything with it at that point. It was there. And so throughout my Christian life, I've always had a very clear understanding that Israel is a work of God in our generation. And it was dormant. I'll admit that it was sitting there as a dormant seed. I wasn't doing anything with it. I would have believed it. I wasn't talking about it with anybody. I certainly wasn't thinking about writing a book about it. And then that changed in 2016, which is where Jeff comes into that you introduced earlier. Jeff, never actually met Jeff at that point, but his son was attending a church where I was the service pastor. And Jeff was planning to go to Israel, and as a ministry, as he's a generous man, and as a ministry, he determined he was going to pay for 3 other people to come on the trip with him. He'd pay all of the fares and everything. And his son had talked to Jeff about me and said, well, you should consider David. He's really good. He said nice things about me, apparently. Very good pastor. And so Jeff came along to the church that I attend on a Sunday night, and his son introduced me to Jeff. I had no idea at this point what was happening, but we talked. I was just about to publish, release a book I'd written called Rediscovering Jesus, on the life of Jesus. And we talked a little bit about that, and then Jeff just came out and asked me, would you like to come to Israel, and I'll pay? And wow, that doesn't happen very often, does it?
No, not very often.
And so I went, and I think it was the experience of being in Israel in 2016. For me, it was very much. I'd written this book about Jesus. The reason I wanted to go was to see the places that I'd written about. I thought that'd be really interesting. And what I didn't expect was that the nation of Israel itself, the people, the Jewish people, that it would impact me in the way that it did. I expected to be blessed to walk in the places where Jesus walked. What I wasn't expecting was to find that on the tour we went to various sites, so all around Israel. It was one of these package deals with UCB. And they took us to a number of sites where guides were talking about the state of Israel and modern history, and I can remember very vividly one particular. I'm probably the only person on the trip that even remembers it because of the effect it had on me, and it was an account. It was a video presentation by the Western Wall, and it was one of the soldiers that had taken part in the liberation of Jerusalem during the 6-Day War. And he talked in that about how, as he was growing up, he'd heard about his grandfather who'd been in a concentration camp, and how every day he used to say to everybody, next year in Jerusalem, next year in Jerusalem was always his mantra. And as a young paratrooper approaching the old city, he talks in that presentation. Some listeners may well know exactly what I'm talking about because they may have been to the same presentation. He talks about how, as he was under fire and approaching the old city, those words kept echoing in his head. Next year in Jerusalem, next year in Jerusalem, and understanding the importance of what it was that he was doing at that moment. And honestly, I just sat there, and at that time I'm a 50-year-old man, and I'm trying not to be emotional. I'm from the northeast of England. We don't do emotions. And I was absolutely broken, just the emotion of hearing that story. And there were other events like that. That one stands out, but I came away from that trip with a very clear... It was like that seed that was planted when I became a Christian. Suddenly it just came to life. And I came away from that trip just with a sense that this is important. You know, clearly God brought me here for a reason at this time. And the, you know, I felt inside that something's changed in terms of my calling, in terms of how God is going to use me, in terms of how I'm going to serve him. And in a sense, the rest is history, because I didn't immediately start writing the book, but that's where it started. That was the start of the journey.
Incredible. So we have these two very brave and bold Australians to thank, and also Jeff as well.
Yeah.
So in terms of your book, Israel and the British Empire, it's very timely. Particularly over the last couple of years, we've been able to look back at history, been able to look at the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Balfour Declaration. Yeah. Look at the 100th anniversary of when General Allenby entered Jerusalem as a liberator, and the British took control after 400 years of Ottoman control. Then followed by this year celebrating the 100th anniversary of the San Remo Conference, which really implemented the Balfour Declaration and gave it that international recognition. And very, very timely as we look back at these key historical events and key anniversaries. But what was the main purpose and reason why you decided to write this from a biblical and Christian perspective?
Yeah, so obviously I had a newfound passion for the subject, and I thought, well, what can I do? And you know, I'm an author, and if I can put it like this, the analogy I would use is the beginning of Luke's gospel, where Luke starts his gospel and he says, having examined all of the evidence and all of the things that's been written, it seemed good to me to also write an account. And I've preached on that before several times, because I think it's an amazing, because when we're looking for the will and purpose of God through our lives, so often we're looking for like a moment where God literally writes on the wall and there's like an overpowering sense of conviction about something. And yet Luke just said, well, it seemed good to me. And it just seemed like a good idea. Well, I can do that. It seems like a good idea. And he ended up writing a gospel that's in Scripture. And I would say it was a bit like that. I'd come back from Israel and I thought, right, what am I going to do with this? You know, at that point, of course, I was new to the concept of Christian Zionism. I didn't know anybody. I wasn't connected to anybody. And I've just got this sense, well, I've got to do something with this. It just seemed, I'm an author. Right, I'll write a book. So I began to do the research. I knew very little about the Balfour Declaration when I started to do that research. Obviously, very quickly realised there's an anniversary coming up. So I started to write furiously, because it seemed, this is 2016, I thought, right, wouldn't it be brilliant to get this book out in time for the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration? And I missed that mark by, obviously, a very long way. But as I started to do the research on that, I was very much focused initially on the Balfour Declaration. I hadn't understood at that point. I didn't know what we did as a country. I thought, well, you know, we beat the Nazis, we did the Balfour Declaration, we did so much to help the Jews. But at that point, I didn't realise that actually there was another narrative that followed behind that. And as I began to do the research and read widely and to understand the true history and things that I'd previously not known about, it took me 4 years to write the book, because there was a lot of research to do. From my starting point, it wasn't a book that I could have written in a year. It very quickly became obvious to me it was going to be a long-term project, that I had to get it right. I had to take my time over it, you know, and had to make sure I'd covered all of the really important things. And when I became aware of the fact that actually, as I explained in the book, that at the time of writing the Balfour Declaration, it wasn't long after that later British governments and officials, and certainly the military at the time of Balfour, were opposed to the concept of of a Jewish homeland and were very supportive of the Arab position, and that actually Britain took a very long time to set the wheels in motion once the Lloyd George government and Arthur Balfour were no longer in positions of governmental power in cabinet. That actually Britain was very obstructive, and I very quickly realised that. So initially, from the to answer your question, from the big biblical point of view, it was very much about remembering that seed, how the creation of the nation of Israel was a fulfilment of biblical prophecy, and very much thinking about presenting Britain as a sort of like a modern day Cyrus the Persian, who had released this declaration that facilitated a regathering of the state of Israel in pretty much the same way as we read about in the Bible. And then realised that there was another aspect that I needed to cover as well. And that is that the Old Testament prophecy, and Jesus himself in the New Testament, when he talks about the goat and the sheep, that the sins of the nations are always related in prophecy to how nations have treated the people of Israel and the Jews. And as I began to uncover some very difficult historical narratives, that I needed to tell that story too, that Britain could expect a blessing from the Balfour Declaration, but alongside that, because we were very slow and actually very obstructive in the early part of the mandate up to the Second World War, and I'm sure we'll come on to 1939, that actually there would be a price to pay for that we'd made a commitment. It was a declaration, it was a political declaration that became a legal instrument when it was incorporated into the San Remo resolution. And there's a price to pay if a nation makes a commitment before God and then breaks that commitment. Absolutely. There's a price to pay for that.
So where do you think it all started to go wrong? Because you had Arthur Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary, who actually signed the Balfour Declaration, which promised the Jewish people their own homeland in what was a province of the Ottoman Empire at the time, during which the British Empire together was with the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand forces, fighting against the Ottoman Turks to liberate the Holy Land from the Ottoman Turks. And we saw that Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister at the time, was very much in favour of supporting the re-establishment of the State of Israel, followed then by the San Remo conference and resolution, which I've discussed earlier this year on the Middle East Report, which gave the Balfour Declaration its international legitimacy. And then it all started to go horribly wrong. Why do you think the British, after promising the Jewish people and the Zionists their own homeland, started then in the 1920s and in the 1930s work against Jewish aspirations for self-determination?
I think there's a few things to say about that, but perhaps initially I think it's worth reiterating and understanding that perhaps uniquely in British history, the cabinet that Lloyd George assembled was a Zionist cabinet, and I don't think we'd ever had there were always Zionists in government, there were Jews in government in very senior positions, but the cabinet that Lloyd George brought together, there'd never been a cabinet before that was so strongly Zionist, and there never was again. And actually, it perhaps wasn't truly representative of the total view of Parliament, the civil service, the military, the British establishment. Now, obviously, we can easily see the hand of God in that as providence, the providence of God, that just at the moment that Britain and the Anzac forces, we must say the Anzac forces, it was actually the Australian and New Zealand forces that played a very large and significant role in beating the Ottoman Turks in Palestine. That just on the moment that the British Empire, if we put it that way, was on the cusp of taking control of Palestine, at that very moment, Britain had a strongly, and perhaps for the only time in its history, Zionist government, Zionist cabinet. But even then, as we look at there was tensions already to be seen in the framing of the Balfour Declaration, and I talk about that in the book that it's quite apparent that there were people involved in. It went through numerous iterations before a final draft was agreed, and there were people who had different views and different emphases that were trying to get their perspective added in. And what really happened is that we produced a declaration which the intention, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the intention of Lloyd George and Balfour was completely honest, was completely, they knew that this was to help facilitate a Jewish state, not just a homeland, but a Jewish state. But I believe that there are other hands involved in the writing of the declaration who perhaps softened it a little bit and made it capable of a different interpretation or to multiple interpretations. You know, that kind of however history would work it out, there were various possible places this could end up. And of course, governments change very quickly and people come and go. It's always been the way of politics. I think it became very obvious as soon as the British military began to exercise governance over the newly liberated Palestine that the military, obviously very powerful force, in those days it mattered politically what the military said and felt, and you know, the military themselves were very hostile. The British Army, the British Army, the British Empire consisted of vast tracts of land that were essentially Islamic, Muslim, and the military felt that favouring the Jews and creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine would make life very difficult for the empire because of the resistance. And of course, we talk about the British Army, but it's important to understand that during the British Empire, the British Army was largely composed of soldiers from all over the empire. And many of those soldiers were Muslim. So the British military were opposed, and then back in Whitehall, back in London, there were politicians that had very pro-Arab views. The establishment, there were forces within the British establishment in Whitehall who were very pro-Arab and in some cases anti-Semitic. And as time moved on, I do believe that there were subsequent, the subsequent governments, they didn't dare rescind. And of course, it had been passed into international law. Britain had a mandate. International law mandated that Britain had to facilitate. Absolutely. It wasn't our decision anymore. We'd been given that as a trusteeship on behalf of the League of Nations and on behalf of the international community to facilitate Jewish immigration into Palestine to create a Jewish homeland. And I believe that there are elements in the British government who regretted that and who were obstructive towards that. And so the story that we see over the first period of the mandate, after San Remo up to 1939, it was quite apparent that the Jewish Agency were facilitating Jewish immigration. Britain constantly were putting limits on that immigration. That also the Arab nationalists were also encouraging immigration of Arabs into Palestine, understanding that controlling land and population density would have an effect on the final settlement. And the British didn't impose any restrictions. So while Jewish restrictions were by the government, Jewish immigration was restricted, Arabs were freely moving into Palestine.
And they were economically as well, because the
British
the
Jews obviously were, the Jews were bringing immense, relative to the area, were bringing wealth with them. They were well supported. Relatively speaking, actually, there were some financial difficulties that the Jewish community faced in Palestine during those years. But they were setting up businesses, they were setting up structures, infrastructure, and to put it bluntly, of course, there was opportunity then. I mean, a lot of the Arabs were making money by selling land to the Jews, and they were getting a very good price.
Yeah, definitely. The Jezreel Valley, I think, that was bought by the Zionist. Was it? That was equivalent of something like £10 million
Yes.
back then, or even 20
Yes.
million. And it was just swampland.
Yes.
Back in the whole Jezreel Valley, which has now become the agricultural centre of
Yes,
Israel.
indeed.
And which they bought. I suppose, looking back at the 1920s, I think what we really see is the Foreign Office very concerned they're losing control.
Yes.
Very concerned that if the Jewish people establish their own state, it'll be paradise. Then the Arab states would want to follow suit, and the British would lose control. And this is why I think they appointed to the position of the Grand Mufti al-Husseini, who was influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, who was a part of that more extreme Arab nationalist movement, who wasn't even part of the Arab establishment living under the British mandate at the time. But they put him in that position thinking that with him in control, we can control him. He will stoke up tension between the Jewish and the Arab communities, and we will have more control and more influence. And I think that is when we started to see things go horribly wrong in the 1920s. But then in the 1930s, and you make very clear in your book about the Green and White Papers that stopped massive Jewish immigration into the British Mandate of Palestine, at a time when the European continent saw the rise of Nazism and fascism and horrendous anti-Semitism during that period. Looking back at this period of history, do you believe that if Britain had allowed the Jewish people to come back to their ancient covenant homeland, how many lives, Jewish lives, could have been saved?
Well, it's hard to estimate, isn't it? Clearly, there was a lot of game playing going on, empire building going on. These were the politicians and establishment. It was the time of the British Empire, and they were playing imperial games, weren't they? And they had the interests of the empire at heart, and there was obviously tension in Palestine. Arabs occasionally would riot. The British response always seemed to be in response to rioting, always seemed to be appeasement in order to, it would be very clear. All of these white papers and green papers, there's a succession of them, and I mentioned them all in the book, where the Arabs would riot, the British government would send a commission who would identify that the Arabs were the cause of the problem, but then go on to identify that Jewish immigration was what was causing the tension, and therefore to resolve it, they would put limits on Jewish immigration. And while, as I've said, the Arabs continued to flood into Palestine. And so it became, for the Arabs, it became something of a learned behaviour almost, like it's a tool. If we riot, then we know that the British will slow down the rate of immigration. And as we get into the 30s, that was happening already in the late 1920s, but as we get into the 30s, overshadowing that, of course, was the events of the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party, and the terrible pressure that the Jewish community began to be put under in Europe, and I believe that that the Germans would have allowed hundreds of thousands, perhaps even 1 million Jews to leave, but there was nowhere for the Jews to go. Some escaped. Many did escape from Germany in that period, but they didn't have a home anywhere else. Other nations were reluctant to take more than a token number of Jews. And so in a sense, anybody could see that there was a disaster, an impending disaster. The Jews would have felt it too. I don't think that they could have foreseen the Holocaust in all of its horror, but clearly that pogroms and persecution was the path before them, and looking for an escape route. At just that moment, Britain was beginning to limit the number that could go to Palestine, and Palestine was an option. It was an option. It was for some Jews, it was the only option, and Britain was effectively closing the doors, not completely closing the doors, but there were millions, and there were 6 million Jews or 9 million Jews in Europe. And Britain was letting in a few thousand, tens of thousands. It was just the tip of an iceberg, And I believe it's a story that I believe isn't told enough. We as a nation, we haven't really taken responsibility for this. It's very easy, and of course it was the Nazis that committed the atrocity, but Britain could have saved perhaps 1 million, perhaps 1.5 million Jews, but it's very difficult to estimate that. Germany would allow Jews to leave, but they had to pay quite a considerable tax. They had to have the means of actually leaving Germany. It wasn't always possible for all Jews to get out, but there were hundreds of thousands at least, but possibly up to 1 million or 1.5 million that, had they been able to get to Palestine, could have been saved.
Absolutely. We have to really kind of speed up because we've got so much to get through, David, because this is such a big program. We can certainly do 2 or 3 programs, a series of programs looking at this period of history. But we also have to acknowledge the incredible role played by Jewish fighters during the Second World War, particularly from stopping the advance of Rommel's forces in North Africa, fighting against the Vichy French in Syria, where Moshe Dayan lost his eye. And so moving on to the kind of aftermath of the Second World War, we see, as you mentioned earlier, 6 million precious Jewish lives were murdered by the Nazis on an industrial scale. The Jewish people then who actually survived the Holocaust found that they couldn't return to their homes because there was no homes or communities to return to. Correct. No one really wanted them, stuck in kind of internment camps. And the only place that actually wanted them was Israel. And this is when we started to see that brave and courageous Jewish people wanted to break the British naval blockade to enter into what was then still the British mandate of Palestine. But why did we see, for example, with the Labour government of Attlee, who came to power in 1945 with his Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, who the Labour Party prior to the Second World War were huge supporters of Jewish self-determination in the British mandate of Palestine. And then what we see is, even despite the horrors of the Holocaust, we see the toughest government policy measures put in place to prevent Jewish immigration to their ancient covenant homeland, particularly after the Holocaust.
Yes, initially, I think during the war, the Jewish Agency were very supportive of Britain, understood that we needed to win the war. But many in Israel had already come to the conclusion that it was only going to be possible to establish a national home and a state if the British were taken out, that the British needed to be removed. Some Jews, of course, began to, around from 1944, began to form groups that were already being hostile. But the general attitude of the Jews in the Jewish Agency was to support Britain to win the war. And I believe that there was a hope that after the war, in 1930, the 1939 White Paper, of course, had limited Jewish immigration to 75,000 over 5 years. And in fact, fewer than 75,000 certificates were actually handed out, which again is a terrible thing to think that even within that restriction, Britain could have given certificates to more than, I believe there was only about 40,000 of those 75,000 that were actually issued. And that's because Britain always, the Jewish Agency and the Haganah began to organise clandestine operations to bring Jews, to save Jews, to bring them into Israel. The British called it illegal immigration. Clearly, it should not have been illegal. That was the whole point of the mandate. The mandate was to facilitate. So how on earth Britain could have called it illegal is itself quite exasperating. But the British deducted those numbers that they estimated had been brought in from the 75,000 certificates that they'd agreed to, and that thereafter it would be in the hands of the Arabs to decide how many could come. And I believe that the Jews supported the war. I think the British game played that a bit and understood that, well, the Jews are going to have to support us against Hitler. Whereas we're not so sure that the Arabs will support us. We're not so sure that the Arabs won't unite with Hitler, so we need to appease the Arabs against all about Arab appeasement. And I think the Jews had reached a conclusion that they needed to get Britain out of the land. But I think that there would have been a hope among the Jews that after the Second World War, Winston Churchill was a supporter of Zionism, that he would rescind the 1939 White Paper. And then there were stories, leaked briefings that the intention of the Labour government, should they be successful, was to send Arabs who had migrated into Palestine back to their own homes. And so I think there would have been optimism among many people in the Jewish community in Palestine that things were going to change. Obviously, history played out. The Attlee government won a huge surprise majority. In the days before polling, I don't think anybody expected that to happen. Ernest Bevin was, of course, appointed as Foreign Secretary, and therefore, alongside the Foreign Office itself, was obviously going to be a key figure in what transpired from there. And against the hopes of the Jews, it very quickly became evident that Ernest Bevin had absolutely no intentions whatsoever to facilitate Jewish immigration.
Can I stop you there? Can I ask you why? Is it because of his views on the Jewish people, because he was considered to be an anti-Semite?
Yes.
And did that play an overriding figure, or was it the fact that he didn't like dealing with Israelis living under the British mandate of Palestine and the actions they took in order to break the British blockade?
Yes, I think it's a combination of all. Clearly, Bevin favoured Transjordan and the Arabs. In fact, British officers at that time were assigned to the Jordanian army. So, Britain was actually supporting both Transjordan. Britain was supporting Egypt. There was an element of empire game playing going on about that. They had to preserve the Suez Canal, obviously the route through to India. And all of the same factors that had affected Foreign Office policy during the 1920s and 1930s were still in play. Britain was trying to clearly engineer and position whatever the final solution was for their advantage. Obviously, Iraqi oil was important in that as well. So Britain was trying to shape the region, and obviously the relationship with France as well. Britain was trying to shape the region in a way that would produce maximum advantage for them. But it's very apparent with Ernest Bevin. I mean, that would be true of the Foreign Office in general. So Ernest Bevin was a reflection of Foreign Office policy anyway. But there are a number of evidences that Ernest Bevin himself was an anti-Semite and had a very poor view of the Jews. The American ambassador to Israel commented that he'd seen Ernest Bevin ranting about the Jews in a way that he said was very similar to the way that Hitler used to rant about the Jews. And certainly as the next 2 years progressed, which we'll perhaps come on to talk about, and the resistance of the Jews against British mandate, Ernest Bevin very, very, very clearly believed that the Jews were in Palestine were. It was almost like it was a conspiracy against him personally. He took it. He seems to have taken it very personally that the Jews had something against Britain in general, but against him specifically. And so you've got a combination of general Foreign Office policy, which is pro-Arab. You've got the head of the Foreign Office, the Foreign Secretary, there's clear evidence from things that he said that he was an anti-Semite, and it was just another occasion where the hopes of the Jews were just completely shattered by the way, the Jews had hoped that after the war, Britain would finally help and facilitate and do what they were mandated to do, what they were legally responsible to do. And Britain just seemed to become worse. And we talked about the blockade, and that's a very disturbing thing to think, isn't it? That here we are, 6 million Jews had been slaughtered. Most of the rest of the Jews in Europe they had no home. They had citizenship nowhere else. It had been stripped from them. In many cases, they had no family because they'd lost all the family. They were still, even 2 years after the war, they were still in internment camps. And Bevan deployed the Royal Navy to the Mediterranean to stop them from attempting to come from Europe to to understand. I mean, at this time, the British Royal Navy is not of that time was much more powerful than the Navy today. It was a battle-hardened Navy. They just fought and won the Second World War. So you're talking about huge cruisers, destroyers, huge quantities of British naval power that was battle-hardened, deployed in the Mediterranean Sea to stop the destitute Jews of Europe on rickety ships from...
David, we have 5 minutes left of the programme, so
Yes.
I have two very quick questions for you, which we need to kind of sum up. The first one is, do you think the story of the Exodus ship, for example, became the symbol of Jewish aspirations and hope and determination for self-determination? And it was the terrible treatment by the Royal Navy and by Royal Marines by
Yes.
boarding the Exodus ship
Yeah.
that actually won Israel world sympathy for the cause of the re-establishment.
Yes,
of the
indeed. I mean,
state of Israel.
it's been called the ship that launched a nation. We don't have much time to talk about it, but this was a period where the Jewish Agency and the Haganah were purchasing dilapidated ships that were perhaps they were barely seaworthy, and that perhaps were should only have had 200 or 300 people on them, and they were packing them full of Holocaust survivors, and then trying to run the British blockade, and very few of them got through. A few did, but most of them were stopped, and the passengers were disembarked at Haifa and sent to the Atlit detention camp, and then after that to Cyprus, where we still held them behind, these after everything that they'd been through, we were still putting them behind barbed wire.
Ooh, yeah.
And and they were still in detention. The Exodus was by considerable margin the biggest in terms of the size of the ship and the number of people. It was 4,500 Jews were crammed on the Exodus. And the name itself, so the Haganah and the Jewish Agency were purchasing these ships and giving them new names. And there was a ship called the Hatikvah. Victory was one. We will not be frightened. There's various names that these ships were given, which was designed, the names of the ships were designed really on purpose to tell a story.
Absolutely. My final question, I think we have to ask really, is that do you believe that there are spiritual consequences on behalf of our nation for breaking the betrayal or betraying the Jewish people and the promises made by the Balfour Declaration, followed by the mandate given by the League of Nations under the San Remo resolution to prepare the Jewish people for their own nation state in fulfillment
Yes.
of biblical prophecy? What are those consequences, and how do we repair the breach?
Yes, and I mean that's the key question, of course. The Bible's very clear. Those who bless the nation of Israel will be blessed. Those who curse the people will be cursed. That was the covenant that was made with Abraham all the way back in Genesis was an everlasting covenant. It wasn't a covenant that came to an end with the New Testament. It was a covenant for all time. And once we believe that the modern state of Israel is an act of God, then essentially Britain, having had the opportunity to be a blessed nation, and the Balfour Declaration would have brought the blessings of God upon our nation. Not only did we renege on those promises, not only did we betray the Jews and act illegally by not facilitating that immigration and causing the death of maybe 1.5 million, might be less, 1.5 million is hard to estimate, causing the death of 1.5 million Jews, there's got to be consequences. There's got to be consequences of that. And ultimately we found ourselves in a position where God had opened the doors, was opening the doors for the Jews to return in fulfillment of prophecy, and Britain were trying to close those doors. And nobody can close a door that God is opening, and obviously it was futile, and the nation of Israel was reborn, according to prophecy. It puts Britain in a position where, and I believe that we need to face up to this, and obviously many Christians do.
Absolutely.
There are many Christians who have spent time on the knees repenting of this, but our government never has. And the general population of our country has no idea about these events. People don't know what we did. They don't understand. If they know anything about it, it's a narrative they see on the news of the events in Palestine today, and they have no idea that we, in a sense, created a lot of those problems.
David, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on the Middle East Report.
Oh, that's fantastic.
You're going to have to come back and do another programme.
I wish we'd had more time, because there's so much to say, wasn't there?
And I just want to thank you for watching today's programme. I can't recommend this book enough, which is Israel and the British Empire. If you want a historical understanding of the role that our nation played during the re-establishment of the modern state of Israel and the portrayal that came afterwards, this is definitely recommended reading. But we also need to pray that our government would repent on behalf of its actions during the 1920s, 30s and 40s. And we want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
This land is mine, God gave this land to me, this brave and ancient land to me. And when the morning sun reveals her hills and plains, and I see a land where children can run free. So take my hand and walk this land with me, and walk this lovely land with me. Though I am just a man, when you are by my side, with the help of God, I know I can be strong to make this land our home. If I must fight, I'll fight to make this land our own, until